All right. Good afternoon. Welcome to the House Committee on Government Operations and Military Affairs. It's been a little bit of a busy, packed day here at the State House, so we're getting started a little bit late, so my apologies to everyone. I wanted to hear first from our witness, Mr. Marshall. Are you still on?
I sure am.
Great. Well, could you please introduce yourself for the record and your organization, and then tell us a little bit about your thoughts on S-135?
Thank you so much. My name is Greg Marshall, and I'm the state director at AARP Vermont. And on behalf of AARP Vermont's 112,000 members, I want to thank you for the opportunity to testify before your committee today. AARP is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to empowering Americans 50 plus to choose how they live as they age. And in doing so, we support policies that enable Americans nearing or currently in retirement, as well as those who will retire in the future, to become financially secure. Saving for retirement is one of the most important things one can do for their futures. VT Saves offers an easy way for employees without access to a workplace plan to grow the savings they need for a secure retirement. Americans are 15 times more likely to put money away for retirement if they have a savings account at work. Yet 40% of Vermont's private sector employees work for a business that does not offer a workplace plan, leaving about 88,000 Vermonters behind. This gap contributes to the growing crisis of Vermonters who lack sufficient savings for retirement and for emergencies. Vermonters' lack of savings is a crisis, frankly, across the board, yet the racial disparities are still striking. In Vermont, Black workers are half as likely to be covered by a workplace retirement plan than their white counterparts. So to reduce wealth gaps and barriers of economic mobility, we need programs like VT Saves. While Social Security is a critical piece of the puzzle, it is not enough to provide a strong financial future for retirees. The average Social Security benefit for people 65 and over is about $21,000 per year, even though these families spent almost $33,000 a year on the basic necessities, things like food, utilities, healthcare, prescription drugs. Vermont Saves will lead to greater economic security for Vermonters as they age, relieving the pressure on social safety net programs and family members who would otherwise not fill this gap. 16 other states have adopted legislation that helps employees save their own money for retirement as they work. And we urge Vermont to join them by passing and implementing Vermont Saves. If passed, AARP Vermont is committed to working directly with the Treasurer's Office and other stakeholders to support a strong and robust public engagement and outreach program on VT Saves to maximize the impact of the program. I just want to say just one more quick thing, that at AARP we view a secure retirement this way. It's a four-legged stool, if you will, and that's a strong Social Security program, a strong Medicare program, people's individual personal savings, and then a workplace savings plan, or being able to save through the workplace. If those four legs of the stool are sturdy, people are going to enter retirement and be able to retire in a much more comfortable way. But as we begin to remove any leg of that stool and it becomes 3, 2, or 1, obviously secure retirement becomes much less likely. So we need those four component parts to work together, but a workplace savings plan here in Vermont for these some 88,000 workers would be critical to helping them save and prepare for the day when they're not working and need a program like this to help supplement their income. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to all of you today, and I'm happy to answer any questions if there's any that you have.
So I take it that the AARP is in strong support of the bill.
We are.
Were there any concerns that that your organization had about the structure or the makeup of this at all, or is it kind of just a full-throated endorsement of this approach?
You couldn't have a more full-throated endorsement from AARP than for VT Saves. We've been really pleased with the work that's been done in committees of both the House and the Senate, and our work directly with the Treasurer's Office. And Chair, we benefit again from some of these states that have gone ahead of us. States like Oregon and Colorado, I'd highlight specifically. which are now well into programs just like this one. So we'll benefit from their experience, and don't have to try to be first in the nation on this. There's already some good stuff going on out there. We believe that we can implement this program and get it up and running, and it will make a really, really huge difference to those folks who work for these small employers, of which we have many in this state, who don't have an opportunity to save through their job and their workplace.
Great. Well, committee, any questions for Mr. Marshallton? Well, thank you so much for being with us and offering the AARP perspective, and also for your patience today. I'm sorry that we were so jammed with training and caucuses and a long floor this morning. So
sounds like a lot going on there today. I'm happy to have waited, would have waited longer. I appreciate your time. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much. Have a good one.
All right. Take care. Thank you.
So now I'd like to invite Becky up to take us through as much of the bill as we can kind of get through, and then we'll sort of figure out what our schedule can accommodate. Thanks so much for being back with us.
Sure, no problem. I just want to see where I have to be right up. Okay.
In that time of year, we're stealing you from a Senate committee, probably.
Okay. Becky Wasserman, Legislative Counsel. Sorry, did you want me to put it up on the screen?
We usually use our own devices.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure.
We have been left to our own
Okay.
devices. I can't believe nobody's played that.
I will continue to let you leave yourselves in your own places. So S-135 is an act relating to the establishment of Vermont Saves. I think I did a very quick overview last time, so I can start at the beginning again if that.
Yeah, I think we since the committee's familiar with it, we could go through a kind of a jog, but I did want to actually hit on each of the points before we try to move on anything. So. Okay,
so I think you all know this, but as an overview, this is creating a program within the Treasurer's Office that is requiring certain employers who are, as defined in the bill, to offer this retirement savings program to employees. And it's a sort of an auto-enroll mandatory program, except the employees have the opportunity to opt out. So it's mandatory for the employer to offer it and optional for the employee to stay in it. So the Section 1 of the bill is creating Chapter 18, which is sort of establishing everything to do with the Vermont Saves program. Section 531 is the definition section that relates to the program. I can go into detail on any of these definitions, but I'll just start with the first one, which is the contribution level, which is how the contribution rate for the participants may be expressed. So right now, and I'll get to this language, the initial contribution rate is 5%. And then, of course, the employee can opt out or do a higher or lower amount. But the contribution level can be expressed as a percentage of the participant's taxable wages, or a dollar amount up to the maximum deductible amount for the participant's taxable year under the Internal Revenue Code. And then in the absence of an affirmative election by the participant, 5% of the participant's taxable wages as reported under the Internal Revenue Code. So that is just how, when that contribution rate is referred to in the chapter, that's the ways it can be expressed. And then on page 2, under covered employee, the definition there is referring to an individual who is 18 years of age or older who is employed by a covered employer and has wages or other compensation that are allocable to the state during a calendar year. This covered employee definition may include a part-time, seasonal, or temporary employee to the extent that the treasurer adopts rules to permit that. A covered employee does not include certain types of employees. So this is an employee covered under the Federal Railway Labor Act, an individual is an employee of the federal or state, county, or municipal corporation, or any of the state's units or instrumentalities. An employee on whose behalf an employer makes contributions to Taft-Hartley Multi-Employer Pension Trust Fund. And then the next definition on page 2, starting on line 20, is covered employer. This refers to a person, entity, or subsidy engaged in business, industry, profession, trade, or other enterprise in the state, and it can be a for-profit or nonprofit. As long as that employer has not offered to an employee or is within a control group that maintains or contributes to in any form within the current calendar year or 2 preceding calendar years, a specified tax favored retirement plan. So you are, an employer is caught by this program if they are not currently and have not in the last 2 years been offering a retirement savings program. If they have not maintained a specified tax favored retirement plan for a portion of a calendar year, ending on the effective date of the chapter, but adopts one for the remainder of that calendar year, that employer is not a covered employer for the remainder of the year. What a covered employer does not include is the federal, state, municipal government, or any unit or instrumentality of the state. An employer that has not been in business during both the current calendar year and the preceding calendar year. And then the next definition on page 3, line 14, ERISA. This is just referring to the Federal Employment Retirement Income Security Act. Internal Revenue Code. These are just referring to the names of the full names of the law, the United States Internal Revenue Code. In subdivision 6, IRA can mean a traditional IRA or a Roth IRA. And subdivision 7, participant means an individual who has an IRA under the program. Turning to page 4, and please stop me if I'm going too fast, too slow. Okay.
So far, seems like we're in the weeds on definitions. Yeah, go ahead.
The definition IRA spurred the comment. Is there a limit to the number of IRAs an individual will have, which would block their participation here?
Well, I know that there's a limit on the amount that a person can contribute in a year.
So it's money, not accounts.
I mean, there's the legal limit to that. I don't know the benefit to having more than one IRA, but I can let the treasurer's office.
If you want to introduce yourself for the record.
Wells, Deputy Treasurer for the record. It's a good question. I'm not aware of any numerical limit on the number of IRAs you can have. There may be one. If there is, it's so high that I've never heard of it. The limit, as Becky said, is on the contributions per year, which is currently $6,500.
So not accounts.
Yes, exactly.
Thank you.
Okay, so I will start on the top of page 4. So there's just some additional definitions. Payroll deduction, and it means the arrangement that an employer allows an employee to contribute to the IRA through a payroll deduction. Program just refers to the Vermont Saves program. Subdivision 10, Roth IRA, is referring to a Roth individual retirement account, as that term is defined in the Internal Revenue Code. And I would note, we'll get to this, but the program sort of defaults to using a Roth IRA, and the treasurer, there's language that allows the treasurer to to allow for a traditional IRA as well, but the default right now is the Roth IRA. Subdivision 11, the specified tax favored retirement plan, refers to those plans, programs, or arrangements that are tax qualified under the Internal Revenue Code. Traditional IRA refers to what a traditional IRA account is defined as under the Internal Revenue Code. Subdivision 13, there's a trust in which the assets of the program are held, and there's some additional language surrounding the requirements for that trust. And then in subdivision 14, there is a definition of vendor, and there is language authorizing the treasurer to contract or have agreements with certain vendors to implement this program. And so this can refer to a federally regulated retirement plan sponsor that conducts business in the state, a company conducting business in the state to provide certain ancillary services such as technological, payroll, or record-keeping services, and offer retirement plans or payroll, deposit, individual retirement account arrangements using products of regulated retirement plan sponsors. A vendor does not include the individual registered representatives, brokers, financial planners, or agents. Subdivision 15, the Vermont Retirement Security Fund. There is a fund that's established in this bill to pay for the administrative costs and expenses of the program. And then finally, subdivision 16, wages, refers to any compensation within the meaning of the Internal Revenue Code that is received by an employee from an employer during a calendar year. So section 532 is the establishment of the program. So subsection A, as I mentioned, the program is established, administered by the Office of the Treasurer, and the stated purposes are increasing financial security for Vermonters by providing access to an IRA for Vermont employees of companies that do not currently offer a retirement savings program. And then the program has to be designed to facilitate portability of benefits through withdrawals, rollovers, and direct transfers from an IRA, and achieve economies of scale and other efficiencies to minimize costs. So then on, just continue on that, and just page 6, line 5, just so that we're all in the same place. So this is the requirements of the program. Subdivision 1 is where it's sort of voluntary for the covered employee to contribute to the IRA, and that can be done through a payroll deduction. And then in subdivision 2 is the mandatory requirement on employers to offer it to covered employees, to this program to covered employees to contribute to the IRA, and that can be through a payroll deduction, or they have the opportunity as well to opt out.
Representative Lee has a question.
Thank you. I don't know if it's in this section or we're back on the covered employee, but I don't see anything in here yet in regards to the amount of time an employee has to be employed by the employer. So on day 1, can that employee be signed up?
Let's see, the employee definition says, just says who is employed by a covered employer and who has wages or other compensation that are applicable to the state during a calendar year. So I don't see a timeline. It just says that they're employed. But this might be a question for the treasurer's office on whether there is a lot of rulemaking and process authority in the bill. So I don't know if there's some intent to create a timeline for that.
I would think it'd be important because again, there's situations where, an employee may only be employed for a week. And how does that transfer to the next employer or again?
Well, so there is a portability aspect to this. So if they had an IRA with a previous covered employer, if they are moving to a new job where that their employer is covered by this program, then the idea would be that it could be portable or to that new program, or if they are moving to a job that is not covered, that they could roll this over into another retirement account.
Gavin, did you want to weigh in on that question?
Yes, Gavin Willis from the Treasurer's Office. It's a great point, and yeah, we certainly intend to be making rules on that topic, among others. As far as, to your point, not having someone who's employed for one day, new retirement account and then have for it somewhere. So not sure where that will land yet, but we've talked to some other states about that issue already, and they all have some sort of, kind of lead-in requirement, whether it's a month or two.
Okay, so it's somewhere around a month or two, maybe.
I think that's what I remember hearing. I haven't had those conversations in a little while, so I apologize if that's not precise.
No, that helps. Thanks.
Follow on to that, would that presumably cover like kids mowing lawns and stuff like that also, as far as being addressing the rulemaking?
A couple of responses to that. One is that folks under 18 are not covered employees. Because if they were, the accounts would have to be custodial IRAs and there'd be parental involvement, it would be very much more complicated. So those folks are not covered, but an older, someone over the age of 18 who is just mowing lawns occasionally would likewise probably not be covered.
Thank you.
I think to that point, though, there is language that a seasonal employee, a part-time or temporary employee could be covered under a rule if the treasurer decides to adopt a rule that allows them to be under that definition.
Okay.
I think we're on page 6, subsection B, the type of IRA. As I mentioned, the sort of default IRA to which contributions would be made currently is a Roth IRA. The treasurer is authorized to add an option for participants to elect to contribute to a traditional IRA instead. And then subsection C, contributions. So as I mentioned, the initial contribution amount is 5% of the covered employee's salary or wages to the program. The covered employee can elect to opt out of that amount at any time or contribute a higher or lower amount than 5%. But then there's keeping in mind that whatever the contribution amount is, it has to be the eligibility limits that are applicable under the Internal Revenue Code. And I think I think that was mentioned at 6,500. Is that correct? Okay. So that would just depend on the employee's salary and what percentage of their wages they were contributing that year. And then in subdivision 2 on page 7, the treasurer can set on an annual basis an increase in the participant's contribution rate. And that's a minimum of 1%, but not more than 8% of salary or wages each year. And that's, of course, within that eligibility limit as well. So that applies to all active participants, but there's the language on page 7, starting on line 8, also gives the participants the option to opt out or elect to sort of decrease or increase that contribution level.
So I know you have to go, and we're approaching 2 o'clock here. I asked Andrea to get you back here at 1 o'clock tomorrow. So we will try to pick this back up then and get our work done in here, hopefully tomorrow afternoon on this bill. So thank you so much, Becky. Sorry to try to squeeze some of this in, but if folks have questions on the contribution pieces, we'll definitely be able to return to that tomorrow. And yeah, it's my intention that we would really have that time tomorrow to get through all the rest of the bill, make sure we have questions answered, and it was still on its way tomorrow. As far as I've heard from the committee so far, there's not a desire to make changes, which I think makes the timeline a little less challenging for us in the rainy days of the session, just in case anyone was nervous.
Thanks very much.
Haven't heard any, knock on wood, amendments for 135 yet. Thank you, both. Great. Committee, switching gears. We had an introduction to the legislative compensation bill S39 that the Senate sent over to us last week. And I thought it would be useful for the committee to hear from folks from NCSL who had done a really great and informative presentation when I was on the Rules Committee last biennium in the context of our legislative survey around compensation and benefits. And so I want to welcome Jocelyn Williams to join us and learn a little bit about what other states are doing in the area of legislative compensation and benefits. So thanks for being with us today.
And thank you so much for having me, Chair McCarthy. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen if that's all right.
That's great.
Okay, it says host is disabled from sharing.
Hey, we're getting you there. We usually will follow along on our own devices, but since you're the only one testifying to us, and I think it might be easier for folks.
I can also just present them without, if that's what works better for you to follow along on your own devices. I am happy to do that as well.
It's great. We've got it up on our legislative docs page, so
okay,
I'll see it.
Awesome. Well, I will just get set up with that then. And I guess I'll just tell you guys when to switch screens then from the different screens. So just to give you a little bit of background for people who may not know, NCSL is a nonpartisan organization that was established in 1975 to serve legislators and legislative staff from the 50 states, 5 territories, and Washington, D.C. And I'm part of the Center for Legislative Strengthening. And what we do at the Center for Legislative Strengthening, which is housed in NCSL, is we do nonpartisan research and analysis for state legislators and legislative staff about legislative operations, the legislative process, legislator pay and demographics, human resource issues, separation of powers. And our goal is to help bolster the autonomy and effectiveness of the legislative branch of government within states. So with that being said, I will take us to our first substantive slide that is titled Legislative Compensation. And we'll just follow along from there. Typically, when I do presentations, I often ask for if people have questions at the end of each slide. Would you prefer for people to hold the questions until the end, or is that fine to do?
No, if folks have questions, I can defer to you on how you like to present. So that works great for us.
I find it's always helpful to ask as we go along for clarification, but I know that sometimes people prefer to hold them all to the end. So when thinking about legislator compensation, it is important to understand that legislator compensation is multifactored. And what I mean by this is that there's not a single thing that can define legislative compensation. And because of this, legislative compensation is going to look different from state to state, as there are different components that can be considered as part of legislative compensation. So at the top of the list, the first thing that you see is salary. And when we think of salary, most typically we think of salary as the income legislators are paid. Most states do an annual salary, but as you people know in Vermont, there's other ways to do that too. Lots of states do it by days, or like how it's done in Vermont, is it can be done weekly. Another component of legislator compensation that is commonly thought of is per diem and mileage. And when we're thinking about per diem and mileage, these are funds typically used to cover expenses associated with legislative service. And the amount and eligibility criteria vary from state to state. So you see vastly different amounts of, especially when it comes to per diem, what the amount is given from state to state, and that's dependent on a variety of factors that I'll touch on later, and also what that money can be spent on, and who is eligible for that money. And then mileage is a bit more straightforward. Many states use the federal rate for mileage, but that can also vary from state to state. Another key part of legislative compensation that we see across many state legislatures is additional compensation for leaders. And again, the amounts vary across states, and it also varies when legislative leaders are eligible for additional compensation as well. And then as we move down the list, there are some factors that might not come right to mind, but could be considered as part of legislative compensation. And these include things like office and staffing. And again, it's going to vary across the states, but often it can cover things like legislative work experiences, like district office space, postage, and potentially even hiring staff to work for a legislator. And then finally, another part of legislative compensation that can be considered are factors like insurance and retirement benefits. Now, not all states offer their state legislators insurance or retirement benefits, and the scope of those plans are going to vary vastly from state to state, with some states where the employee is paying or state where the compensation in terms of insurance and retirement benefits is similar to that of state employees, and it's the exact same plan that any state employee would be on, whereas other plans have the legislator paying for all of the insurance plan. Do you guys have any questions on legislative compensation and the information presented on this slide before I continue?
I don't see any hands up yet.
Great,
When we
great.
get into the details, I'm sure there will be some.
So what I'm going to look at now is the range of annual legislator salary. One of the things that I want to point out when looking over this data is the data that we have accrued and collected at NCSL was collected in spring of last year in 2022. NCSL collects legislator compensation data every single year. In fact, we have a survey out in the field right now. We're trying to wrap it up, and hopefully we'll have an updated information online about 2023 soon. I say that to caveat that some of these numbers, if you're following different states work on legislator compensation, might be slightly out of date, but they're fairly similar, and we do update it annually, and you can look forward to seeing those updated numbers on our website in the near future. But when looking at what legislator salary looked like last spring, is you can see that there's really a wide range in what is legislator salary, ranging from a state that has $0 or they don't provide any salary for their legislators, to at the time it was California with a legislative salary of just below $120,000. To note that we do know that that has changed, and currently, to the best of my knowledge, New York has the highest legislative salary now at $142,000. And so that's obviously quite a big difference between, a six-figure salary to a state like New Mexico that does not offer a salary. But the one thing that I want people to take away from when looking at this slide is that not paying legislators anything or paying a legislator a six-figure salary really is not the norm. Those are both outliers. When we look at two average factors, the mean and the median, we can see that the average salary for state legislators when it comes to the mean is just under $40,000, according to our 2022 data. And the median salary puts it right around $30,000. So that is much more in line with what most state legislatures are doing. And if we move on to the next slide, which is annual legislator salary 2022, when you look at the plotting on this graph, and I should note that these are states that have annual salaries. So because it's a bit more tricky to configure what an annual salary is for states that pay daily or weekly, because it varies from year to year, and sometimes will vary from legislator to legislator based on days that they can claim. So we just use for this information here states that have annual salaries. And what I would like people to take away from looking at this is, well, we do have some states that are, have a very high salary, that we see a couple of these little stars that are near 120,000 or near 100,000. And there are some clustering of stars that are falling below $20,000 annually, that the bulk of our stars are falling somewhere between $20,000 and $60,000. That is where we're seeing a lot of legislative salaries sit. Does anybody have any questions on legislator salaries based on these two slides?
Representative Hickey.
Devin, I noticed you had went to New York at 142,000. Is that, and this, you said these are 2022 figures. I see
Yes.
on the chart, though, it's down about 115,000.
Yeah,
Is
so
it that
that's,
kind of a raise?
Yeah, you just.
yeah.
Okay.
Yes, so after we collected the data in 2022, I believe it happened last winter, so like believe like November, December of 2022, New York voted to give state legislators a raise and raise the legislative salary to $142,000. And I was just bringing that up in context because I know that lots of people, when I talk to all different types of people, legislators, legislative staff, other people about legislative salary, a lot of times when they look up their data, they're like, well, I just read an article and you say the highest salary is $119,000 in California, but I just read that New York salary is this. So I was just showing that how the salaries change after we collect the data. And for logistical reasons, we just collect data once a year. We only update our data set once a year as a practice of consistency. So you will see that new salary for New York updated when we release our 2023 data.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Any other questions before I continue? All right.
Just that I don't see Vermont on there. Is that a specific reason?
Yes. So what we did from this chart was only looking at in terms of just graphic making the states that have annual salaries. So 14 states will do legislator salaries daily or weekly, and the remainder of the states have an annual salary. And so for plotting on this chart, we just utilize states that did an annual salary.
Okay, thanks.
All right, I'm going to pop us along then to legislator salary, alternative pay structures. Oh, it's 8 states. I apologize. I said 14 before. It's 8 states. Legislator salary, alternative pay structures. So before, those states that we were talking about, those averages, those means and averages were coming from states that chose to pay an annual salary, but 8 states do not have an annual salary. Instead, these 8 states will tie legislative salary to things like session days, calendar days, session weeks. And examples of these, beyond what's done in Vermont, is in Utah, legislators are paid $285 per legislative day. Similarly, in Nevada, legislators are paid just under $165 per calendar day for up to 60 calendar days, and that is where their pay gets capped at. Do people have any questions on this before I move to the next slide?
In your work, Jocelyn, is it difficult to kind of compare the total compensation, or I think you're going to get to sort of trying at that later in the presentation, if I remember. It's been a little while since I was on that last one, but it can be kind of hard to compare apples and oranges with states doing per diem versus weekly versus salary, and then the range of benefits and compensation is a little bit.
Yeah,
Ducks
so
and chickens.
it is different, and I'm actually, as a researcher, kind of grappling through this right now. Somewhat related, we had out in the field through 2022, from late 2021 to 2022, the Legislator Time and Demographics Survey, which asked state legislators a lot of questions. Some people in this room might have filled it out about their legislative work and their life. And we're merging in our compensation data, and currently I'm trying to work on a way to translate states that have an annual or have a weekly or daily salary into like what an average annual is for that state. And it's proving to have to do some brainstorming on how to adequately get at that for what that is. So yes. And hopefully I can in the future give kind of a difference as we kind of work through trying to find out, like, and again, it can vary year from year. So for a lot of states that have annual salaries, right, it's going to be somewhat, they might do a slight pay increase from one year to another. The pay might change slightly, but the annual salary is going to be the same. Whereas if we tie something to like session length, if there's variation in session length, that could create, you know, a larger degree of differentiation in salary from year to year, if that makes sense.
Representative Hooper has a question.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Does Nevada cap their legislative session at 60 days also?
I can go back and check on that. I do not remember off the top of my head, unfortunately. I wish I was a walking index of every single state and its practices, but I am limited in that working memory in my head, but I can go back and double check. But I believe, according to my memory, and I'll be happy to email that information to Andrea and the chair, and they can share it on to everybody on the committee. I believe what gets complicated in Nevada is that they try to cap at 60 days, but there's times when session can go over, and then pay is capped at 60 days, as opposed to a legislature that pays a per diem, and it's for however many days they're in session. But don't hold me to it. I will double check that information that I just gave you guys and verify that it is correct. Any other questions?
I think we're good for now.
All right, excellent. So the other part when considering legislative salary, because we've spent a lot of time talking about, there's a great deal in range when it comes to legislative salary. And, you know, from $0 in New Mexico to 6 figures in states like New York and California, is understanding what's driving that. What is making a legislative salary be larger in some states and smaller in other states? And one useful way to think about this is understanding how legislative salary correlates with NCSL's legislature typology. So in terms of legislator typology, NCSL categorizes states as full-time, part-time, and hybrid. Typically, when we're thinking about full-time legislatures, these are the states that are going to be green, and we call full-time and full-time light. So there's kind of a gradation between those two full-time. So they're the states that you see in green. And in general, with these states, we're thinking about states that have longer sessions, larger districts. Legislators report spending more time on the job, and oftentimes there's a salary, the salary is large enough that it allows legislators to be, quote unquote, and I understand this term is complicated, but full-time, as in serving as a legislator is their full-time job or full-time employment. When we go and look at part-time states, and those are the states that are in yellow and gold on the map, and Vermont and some of your neighbors, New Hampshire and Maine, also fall into this category, are considered part-time legislatures because legislators report to us that they spend less time on the job, that there's typically a shorter session, there's a smaller staff serving legislators, and oftentimes there's a need for outside employment for state legislators in terms of an income. There's not an ability to just rely on the salary that is associated with legislative work for an individual. And then all of our states in gray are what we consider hybrid, and they fall somewhere in between the two. So it's a little bit of a chicken and egg situation when you think about legislative salary and legislative typology, but there are more factors that go into legislative typology. And we do know that these states that have longer sessions that put a requirement on legislators to spend more time on the job, maybe because they had more session days, the session's going longer, and typically have maybe a larger legislative staff, that there tends to be a higher pay for state legislators as well. And these averages, once again, are pulled from states that have annual salaries. And in 2022, the average annual salary for full-time legislatures was just above $75,000. For hybrid legislatures, or those states that are in gray that kind of fall between the full-time and the part-time, was just above $30,000. And for part-time legislatures, or our gold states, that was around $13,000. And some takeaways beyond this gradation in salary dependent on legislature typology that I think is important to pick up on. Again, when we're talking about that range from no legislator salary to $120,000 or $140,000, is that even in states that the salary, that big salary of bigger salary of $140,000 is captured in our green states, the average is not $140,000. So for The average for those states is closer to 76. And then for our part-time legislatures or gold states where a state like New Mexico falls, that does not have a legislator salary, that is not the norm. That is not common. What we're seeing there as an average is around $13,000. Does anybody have any questions on legislator typology and legislator salary? Excellent.
That's pretty self-explanatory. Thank you.
Move forward. All right. So what I'm going to move us into now on our presentation is on the slide, compensation differences across the states in terms of salaries. And what I have done using our data from 2022 and 2021 to further clarify on our data collection. NCSL does collect compensation data annually, but we change the scope of what we collect dependent on year. And every other year we do a comprehensive survey that asks about salary, per diem, mileage, additional compensation for leadership, insurance benefits, other forms of compensation. And that happens in our odd number year. So we last collected that in 2021, and I'm currently collecting that data right now. And the even number year, so like last year in 2022, we did an abridged version of that salary, or that an abridged version of that survey, which just asks about mileage, per diem, and salary. So that's why you'll see data from 2022 and 2021 in this presentation. So to help everyone situate how Vermont potentially compares to other states, I decided to highlight 4 different states and show how compensation is situated in those states. I've chosen New Hampshire and Maine as they are your geographic neighbors, but also they are categorized by NCSL using that legislator typology, if you go back on that previous slide, as being part-time. And so we can see some similarities in terms of things like time on the job, session days, legislative staff, etc. I also chose Colorado because Colorado is oftentimes in terms of everything from session length to compensation and other components of institutional design, a pretty classic example of a part-time legislature or a hybrid legislature. So those gray legislatures. And then we chose California because it's probably the most well-known or salient example of a quote unquote full-time legislature. And so I'm not going to go through and read these slides off for you because all that data is there, and it could be tedious to hear me read things like 25% of the base salary for the state is this. But I did want us to go through and look at it so I could highlight some of the differences. And one of the interesting things that I wanted to bring up when thinking about part-time legislatures and comparing our 2 examples of New Hampshire and Maine when looking at salary is that you can see there's variation there. So Maine offers a salary of around $15,000 for the first regular session, and then just under $11,000 for the second regular session, whereas New Hampshire only pays its legislators $100 a year every year. You can see kind of in alignment with what we were talking about, that you can see an increase in legislator salary when you move into states that are considered a hybrid or somewhere in between a full-time and a part-time legislature. On a state like Colorado, that pays legislators $40,000. And I believe Colorado meets for 120 days or something approximate to that. California is a full-time legislature. They're technically in session year-round, and they pay just in 2022 just under $120,000. Another component to think about when thinking about compensation is additional compensation for leadership. And when we're thinking about additional compensation for leadership, we can think about that in a state like New Hampshire, the presiding officer will make $50 for a 2-year term, as compared to in a state like Colorado, leaders receive $99 a day during the interim when they're in attendance at a committee or a leadership meeting, or during session as well. Whereas in a state like California, you see a larger kind of additional annual salary given to people in leadership positions. Do people have any other questions about compensation differences across the states with these 4 states that I've highlighted?
Representative Waters-Evans.
Thank you. Hi. I am wondering if you have, and if you do have it, if you have compared it to the salaries, demographic data on the makeup of what kind of people make up the legislatures in these different states.
So yeah, in terms of the demographics of who's serving, in terms
Yeah.
of, let me make sure I'm understanding what you're saying. Is there a connection between the demographics of somebody serving in a state that's making $15,000 annually as a state legislator, as opposed to serving in a state where somebody's making $40,000 annually as a state legislator? Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I'm guessing that there is a difference. I'm just wondering if you have those figures that you've ever compared to see exactly what that difference is. Or
We
that you could
have
make a
not
guess on.
had that data in the past. We are hopeful that as we concluded the collection of our legislative time and demographic survey at the end of 2022, and we're in the process of doing analysis. And I do not know if that analysis will include as direct of a comparison of this pay results in these types of demographics of legislators, but we're hoping that the data from that survey combined and that survey data will be we're in the process of writing the report, and it will be available in the coming months. Plus, if anybody attends our NCSL annual summit, we will be doing a whole presentation on that data. But we are going to help develop a picture and an understanding of what is the relationship between who serves when and where, based on different factors of institutional design. So that could include things like compensation or session length, term limits, etc.
Thanks.
Yes, Representative Nugent.
I was wondering if you have information contextualizing some of these salaries, like how do states decide what to pay their legislators?
That's a great question, and it really varies from state to state on how they decide how legislative salary is set. At NCSL, we categorize the way that legislator salary is set using 3 different mechanisms. One is that legislative salary is determined either via constitution or statute. And so that would be like listed in the state's constitution. That's where you'd say, this is what the annual salary is for state legislators, or maybe the Constitution leaves the power up to the legislature to set their salary. And so you'll see that annually in statute, that's where the legislative salary is set. Some states, to address that becomes complicated, which I'm sure is relevant to people listening today, in the sense that there could be it's a complicated and difficult scenario when legislators are setting their own salary, right, or responsible for determining their own salary. It gets into a situation where legislators are cognizant of the political implications of setting their own salary. And so there has been a movement in some states to move away from legislators directly determining what their salary is. And in those states, there's 2 different mechanisms that are most often used. One mechanism is tying salary to an external factor. And so in states that tie salary to an external factor, oftentimes we'll see there is oftentimes it is decided that legislator salary is going to be tied to median income in the state. The legislator salary is going to be set at a base rate, and you're going to get cost of living adjustments every so often. Legislator salary, I've seen in some states, is tied to another state employment office that they think is comparable. So maybe a county judge, that's used in some states. And so that's what we call tying it to an external factor. The third way that legislator salary is determined is using a compensation commission. So California uses a compensation commission. Colorado uses an external factor when setting their legislative salaries. And in terms of a compensation commission, oftentimes a compensation commission in most states is a commission that is that has people independent of the state legislature on the commission, and they do a review of an analysis on a variety of factors and determine what they think an appropriate legislator salary is, and there are within those compensation commissions a real range for the amount of autonomy the commission has versus the authority legislatures still have over that salary setting. So in some states, there will be the commission independent of the legislature has the power to set the salary. Whenever the commission decides the salary is going to be, that is what the salary would be. In other states, state legislatures still have somewhat what I call passive control over setting the salary. For example, in Alaska, part of the statutory language that established this compensation commission says that Alaska has, I believe it's something like approximately, it's a finite period of time. And I think it's either 10 or 30 days. And it's like legislatures, once the legislature, once the commission has determined what salary should be, has a certain number of days to vote to overturn the salary. And if they don't, it has the effective law. So they aren't required to vote on it. If they just let it sit, it becomes what the new salary is. Other states like Connecticut requires the legislature to vote and approve the commission's recommendation. And so certainly the way that a state has determined that they're going to set legislator salary is going to have a potential effect on what salary is. Do people have any more questions on that?
I think a good thing for us to think about is how many states have sort of changed that in one way or another as we look at what we've done. I think we heard in testimony, maybe our legislative counsel who's looked into this a little further can back me up. But I think what we did in Vermont was we used to tie our compensation to a weekly amount that was tied to average or median income. And then it morphed into just setting a fixed thing and having a small inflation adjuster. And so we kind of got way behind that average weekly income estimate over time. I think that started sometime around 20 years ago.
Yeah.
I think the time is anecdotal, but I think because it did lag behind because of Jennifer Kirby, legislative counsel, because of the indexing, it lagged behind. Wasn't able to find anything definitive saying whether it was originally set 20 years ago to be the average week, but that is the number we started from with S39.
Gotcha.
I shared in the chat for the Zoom, but I will also go ahead and email it as well. As NCSL actually has a report all about legislative compensation setting that you can go through and see how each state sets a legislative compensation, and talks a little bit about those nuances and differences, and also talks about the challenges that states have to consider when choosing which method to set compensation. And I wouldn't call it pros and cons, but the different dynamics that surround each method of setting compensation. So I'll make sure that gets out to everyone, since that seems like it'd be relevant to the conversations you're having. All right. I'm going to move on to our next slide if there's no other questions on more about per diem and mileage. So when thinking about per diem and mileage, there is no singular way to approach per diem and mileage. Each state handles it differently. When thinking about mileage, many states do tie mileage to the federal rate. And if there's a change in mileage, that's automatic. If the federal rate goes up and down, so is the mileage in the state. But some states do choose to set mileage different from what the federal rate is, or not tie it directly to the federal rate. It might mirror or match the federal rate, but they have to decide to change it, to update it if the federal rate updates. So there are going to be differences on what the federal rate is. And some states, depending on the size of the state, might also have some reimbursement for other modes of transportation as well, depending on the size and geography of the state. Where we really see a lot of variation is when we see the variation on per diem. And there's a lot of different ways to think about per diem. Oftentimes per diem is considered general daily compensation for per diem. And so this is compensation to cover daily expenses. And that's one way to handle it. And so some states will just give legislators a general amount for per diem. So for example, a state might say every legislator receives $100 per day on days that a legislator is in session or doing committee work. And there's no requirements for how that money is going to be spent, or there's no sort of accountable plan. Other states require that specific amounts of per diem go towards lodging or food. And so some states might say legislators get up to $125 a day to use on lodging and $75 a day for food. And I'm just spitballing numbers right here. This is not tied to a specific state. I'm just trying to show the difference between the two. Some states do the same per diem for everyone. And so it doesn't matter, like in a state, if you live 5 miles away from the capital, if that's where your home is, you know, that's where your district is, or if your home district is 150 miles away from the capital, people will be getting the same per diem daily. So it's the same amount for everyone. Other states tie per diem eligibility, so being eligible for per diem or the amount that you get to distance from the capital. So for example, 2 of our western states, Colorado and Arizona, which are geographically larger states, make a differentiation between the distance that legislators districts or homes are from the capital and the per diem that they are eligible for. And so people who are from further away get a higher amount of per diem than people who could likely be considered, for example, in Arizona, if you live, I believe, within Maricopa County, which is where the capital is located, they're going to receive a smaller per diem than their counterparts who live further away. And some states, there's slightly different amounts for senators and representatives, so can be chamber dependent as well. And I kind of touched on this before on the different specific amounts. And the final 2 components are intertwined, as some states are vouchered and unvouchered. So some states, legislator per diem is just given as a base amount that people receive. So for example, my example is saying that some states might just automatically give state legislators $100 per day and per diem to spend to cover, the cost of legislative service, and legislators aren't required to, turn in receipts or verify their spending. Whereas other states use a voucher system, and they might say legislators are eligible for up to $100 per diem per day, but you have to turn in basically receipts to show how that money was spent. And I know this has been of interest to many legislators, is understanding the difference between taxed and untaxed per diem. And that's because the 2018 Tax and Job Act kind of changed how per diem is handled in tax as considered part of legislative salary for state legislators. And it used to be that the scope of per diem that was considered tax exempt or tax deductible as terms of being income tax exempt or income tax deductible was much broader. And changes have kind of tightened that into to the types of per diem that can be considered untaxed. And some states do still have untaxed per diem. And that is dependent on 2 factors: the legislators who are able to claim per diem as untaxed. And this is something that NCSL does not offer tax advice. And if there's questions on taxation of per diem and eligibility of per diem to be tax exempt or tax deductible, we really encourage legislators to talk with somebody who is an expert in that matter area. But to my understanding, if in some states, if legislators are using an accountable plan, so they're having to report how they're spending their per diem, and it in the per diem is equivalent to that of federal rates for per diem. And I believe it is if the legislator's tax home is over 50 miles from the state capital, then if like all those factors come into play, per diem can be considered tax exempt. But as you can see, that means that there's going to be a wide variation between states on how per diem is managed and handled and how it plays into being a part of legislator compensation. And even there's going to be variations in some states like Colorado or Arizona, where they structure per diem differently for different legislators to what per diem is and how that plays into somebody's overall compensation as a state legislator. Do people have any questions about per diem and mileage?
Is there, on some of the states that have like a lower salary, has per diem been a way for legislators in those states to get sort of like more of the, not just their expenses covered? I think in Vermont, one of the things that's pretty much the worst kept secret about what we do is that, we get a daily per diem that, it's basically just part of the compensation package for being a legislator. It is obviously there are daily expenses, but we're not one of the states that requires any kind of reporting for the receipt of that per diem. So I'm wondering how common that is to have the per diem be kind of just rolled up into the high percentage.
Yeah, I don't have a number that I can give you where I can say this number of states, handles per diem this way or that. And like, this is like, that's X amount of their salary, but what I can say is that in many states, that per diem, and this is why I always talk about legislative compensation as opposed to legislative salary or legislator salary, right? Legislator compensation versus legislator salary is that compensation is a lot broader than salary. And I would say that your insight is not uncommon across other states, that the compensation that comes in the form of per diem can be impactful to the overall compensation package. I think, when thinking about different states with salary versus compensation, if you're talking about comparing states, if we look at New Mexico and New Hampshire, and I'm going to just pop to the next slide here because I actually have New Hampshire's up, is New Hampshire offers no per diem to their state legislators. So I'm on the compensation differences across states slides for anybody who's following around. So New Hampshire, they offer no per diem to legislators. So legislators receive that $100 annual salary and no per diem. New Mexico does not offer any salary to its state legislators, but does pay per diem. And I don't remember what the total amount is for states, but one of the things is that what that technically means is that even though New Mexico legislators do not receive a salary for their legislative work, their overall compensation for legislative service ends up being higher than New Hampshire that does have a salary, if that makes sense.
Does this sound, New Mexico is $247 a day in per diem.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's another way to do it. A little bit more of an extreme version of what I was talking about.
Mileage.
Yeah. So as you pointed out, there's really going to be a variation. So on this chart that I have on the slide, compensation differences across the states, mileage or per diem, you can see how states like New Hampshire, Colorado, and California tie their mileage to the federal rate or match the federal rate. But a state like Maine has chosen not to tie it to the federal rate, and their mileage is a bit lower. But they also have this added factor. They say that legislators, on top of this 46 cents per mile, they are also eligible for toll reimbursement. So the power really is within states to determine how they're going to compensate legislators when it comes to mileage. And per diem is no different. When looking across our 4 example states here, New Hampshire does not have any per diem. Maine offers $38 a day for lodging or round trip mileage, and $32 a day for meals. Where in Colorado, this is that example that I was giving, and it's vouchered, right? In Colorado, legislators residing within 50 miles of the capital get $45 a day, and legislators living more than 50 miles from the capital get $234 a day, but it is vouchered, so legislators would have to report how they're spending that. And in California, you can see the difference here that senators receive $211 a day and per diem, and representatives receive $214, so a $3 difference between chambers, but the same for all legislators. So really, it's going to fluctuate greatly from state to state on what per diem is, but I think that the insight that was already brought up, that's important, is that when thinking about total compensation, per diem can be impactful on top of just salary as well. Do people have any further questions about per diem or mileage?
Don't see any hands. Thanks, Jocelyn.
Perfect, thank you. Then the final component of compensation that I'm going to talk about today in terms of compensation and thinking about the different forms of compensation coming in is benefits packages. And this data was collected from 2021, and we're looking at health insurance. And I will send all these links on as well. NCSL also clicks beyond just health insurance information on dental and vision insurance as well. But for this slide, I just focus on health insurance and retirement benefits. And again, you can see how these are situated in terms of being a compensation benefit for state legislators really varies from state to state. So, for example, in New Hampshire, the health insurance plan is going to be the same as state employees, but it's optional, and the total cost is going to be the legislator's expenses, as compared to states like Maine, Colorado, and California, where it's the same as the state employees plan. So Colorado and California, it's the same as the state employees plan, but the legislator is going to pay a portion of that plan, and the state's going to pay a portion of this plan. In Maine, it's the same as the state employees plan, but the state covers 100% of the legislator's coverage and 50% of any beneficiaries on the plan's coverage. So again, I feel like I say the same thing again and again, but it's really important that when we're thinking about compensation, there's a lot of ways to kind of come at legislator compensation, and each state's going to kind of handle it differently. You can't just think about salary. You can't just think about per diem. You have to think about, like also what's going into compensation in terms of health insurance, which types of health insurance is available for state legislators, how much of that cost is the state covering. Similarly for retirement, Maine and Colorado have retirement plans available for state legislators, but states like California, New Hampshire, so on opposite ends of the spectrum, we're talking about, a full-time legislature and a part-time legislature have no retirement plan available for their legislators. And so, sometimes those differences, a lot of times we've seen a pattern of the compensation across all those different factors being similar between states and a part-time legislature and similar for states and a full-time legislature. But as you can see here with the retirement benefits, that sometimes states really beyond what legislative typology they fall under, customize legislator compensation best to meet the norms and cultural factors in their own states, or have different compensation plans. It's not every single full-time legislature is going to have a retirement benefits plan for legislators. They might not, and part-time legislatures like Maine might have a retirement benefit plan as well. Any questions on this idea of compensation as it relates to health insurance or retirement benefits?
Don't see any hands up here. Thank you.
Then the next part of legislator, the other factors and practices around legislator compensation and employment that I wanted to bring up today was legislative service and outside employment, because often legislator compensation and outside employment are often two things that are considered hand in hand. And this data was collected by NCSL in 2019. And one of the things to note is that no state bans employment outside of the legislature generally. Some states have constraints on public employment and legislative service. So you can't hold another, public job and be a state legislator as well. But there's no general ban, no state has a ban that says you can't, own a business and be a state legislator. You can't, work for a company and be a state legislature. There's no sort of ban like that. As of 2019, 16 states have legislative leave law to protect outside employment during legislative service. 10 of these states cover private and public employees, and 6 of these states cover just public employees. And so oftentimes what these types of laws generally are covering are saying that people that have basically the right to take a leave of absence from their job and to go perform legislative work, and once their legislative work is over, to be able to return to their job and their job is protected. Any questions on legislative leave laws? The final component of kind of legislative service and employment that I think is important to consider is legislative service and caregiving. And this has become a more salient issue, I'd say, in recent years. And several states balance this issue of caregiving and legislative service both formally and informally. In 2022, the Colorado Assembly became the first state to pass 12 weeks of paid family leave for members of their legislature. So Colorado legislators have 12 weeks of paid family leave to use when needed. They are, as of right now, the only state that does have officially, as determined in statute, paid leave for state legislators as kind of an employment, for lack of better words, employment benefit. However, several states, we have records of several states having chamber rules to accommodate caregiving. So approving sick leave or approved absences for people who are serving as state legislators who also need to engage in caregiving, allowing children on the chamber floor, providing nursing rooms. And for example, some have more official rules, like the Massachusetts Senate has a rule specifically addressing paid parental leave. The other thing to note is some states do allow the use of campaign funds for childcare for state legislators. That's not in every state. Any questions on legislative service and caregiving?
So we're going to be due up on the floor in a few minutes, but does anybody have any kind of last questions or burning thoughts? Jocelyn's given us a lot of information about other states, and I really appreciate the link you sent with both and the comparative information about what different states are doing that NCSL's collected, because I think it helps us think about what some of the different levers are that we can pull in our work.
Absolutely. And I will send out an email with our link to our 2021 data, our 2022 data on compensation, because then you can compare every single state. I chose to highlight just 4 states today in my presentation, but if you guys are really curious about what's going on in Idaho or Pennsylvania or Hawaii, you'll be able to use those links to help you better understand that as well.
Great. Jocelyn, thank you so much for being with us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to present. It was my honor.
Thank you. Well, everybody, that's it for today. So tomorrow we'll be trying to wrap up our work on Vermont Saves, hopefully, with Becky. And if anybody has any questions or concerns about that, putting that back up for vote on the agenda tomorrow. So stay tuned for that. I also will be releasing an amendment that makes a tweak to the ranked choice voting bill that we had talked about, which would make it so that the municipal opt-in is just by vote. That the whole convoluted thing of select boards can do it versus that it's just one straightforward path. If towns want to opt in, it's just by the voters, based on our conversation the last time we were digging in on that. So I'll try and get that language released so everybody can see that before we look at it tomorrow. But I'd asked him to look at that and he finally got me a draft. So there were other thoughts that folks had on that. Definitely be in touch with Mr. Devlin. But yeah, that'll be a little bit of our work tomorrow. And I imagine some of our bills may start coming back from the Senate forthwith. So keep your eye on the agenda as Thursday, Friday, things may get, we may be doing 15 minutes on a proposal of amendment here and 20 on there. So it's going to be a little bit of rocky times with the agenda as we try to wrap up our work for the session. But